thank you all for being here, and for some of you, regular class period, for others, not regular class period, but we are really excited to have Stacy Lischka with us today. And she has one of those careers that some of you may be dreaming about in your future. She works for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but she's a human dimensions researcher with them, so she's a social scientist working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And she's able to explore all of the kind of dimensions that we've been exploring in 611. Conflict, community collaboration. How do you resolve these things? How do you work with them? And oftentimes it takes this unique approach that integrates both social and ecological sciences. And so Stacy's here today to talk with us about how she does that and how her work is helping to resolve some of the conflict around humans and black bear in Durango. And she's also a PhD student currently at Colorado State University. And so let's welcome her to a class.
Thank you, guys. I feel very official with the microphone and the introduction and everything like that. I wanted to start just with a little bit of background on me, and mostly because many of you probably know Ryan Wilbur, who's a technician working for me right now, and also a student in the same program that you guys are in. And so we've talked a lot about what this program is like and what a cool opportunity it is. And I thought I'd start just with a little bit of background about me because I think it might resonate with some of you. I started my sort of educational adventure. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and I did my undergraduate degree in wildlife ecology at the University of Wisconsin. And so I always sort of make this joke about how, because I'm from Wisconsin, I have this strong sense of Midwestern loyalty. Is anybody from the Midwest? Nice. So you understand. I wish there were more people. It might be a little bit better, but I have this strong sense of Midwestern loyalty, right, to represent Wisconsin everywhere that I go. And so I sort of have this thing that I like to quote Aldo Leopold in every one of the presentations I do, because he started this whole field of wildlife ecology in Wisconsin at the department where I got my undergrad degree. So it's a tiny bit of braggery and then a tiny bit of loyalty. So I did, as I said, I did my undergrad degree at Wisconsin. And while I was there, I spent 4 years doing research in the limnology department in fisheries, and I was trying to remove an exotic fish species manually from a small lake in northern Wisconsin. So that meant running gill nets, for any of you who are fisheries folks, running gill nets and traps to catch rainbow smelt. So they're a fish, about that big, and they were introduced into this lake intentionally, it turns out. So we spent a whole bunch of time and a whole bunch of money trying to get this fish species out of the lake to restore it to a more natural system where walleye production, which is a really favored game fish in the Midwest, could recover. And kind of at the end of that 4 years that I spent working on that project, I had this kind of epiphany. And this Leopold quote that I put up there sort of captures it for me. We spent all this money, we spent all this time getting rid of this fish species, but there were 8 cabins around this lake, and what I realized was that at the end of that, at any time in the future, one of the 8 people who lived there, or one of the hundreds of people who come to that lake to fish in any given year, could just decide that they wanted rainbow smelt back in that lake and wipe out everything that we had done. So it became this sort of we could easily identify the ecological mechanism that we needed to change, but to make that successful, we had to understand this sort of human component. Why did people put that fish species in that lake? Why did we decide as researchers it was valuable to get rid of it? And how did we keep it that way if we really thought that was a valuable thing? So I sort of sat in my apartment in my senior year of college and thought, what am I doing? Why am I spending all this time and effort if somebody could sort of come in and erase it? And so I decided, I worked for a little while, and then I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school to learn more about this people part of it, this human management part of it. And so I got a master's degree at Michigan State University. Shifted at that point from working in fisheries and working really in those ecological sciences to human dimensions and social sciences and natural resources. And I worked there on white-tailed deer, which are sort of an cultural analog to mule deer here, especially on the western slope, in that they're a very important game species. Schools close down in Michigan and Wisconsin on opening day of deer season. It's an important cultural, piece of the culture in the Midwest. And so I'm going to put this Gifford Pinchot quote up, who also has a Wisconsin tie. He was the first head of the Forest Service, but immediately before that, he ran the Forest Service's lab, a research lab at the University of Wisconsin. And so, he's a forester, so he's specifically talking about the trees here, but what he says is that, to start with in terms of addressing a problem, you had to know something about three pieces: the people, the country, and the trees. And of course, he points out again that the people piece of it was most important. And what I learned through that process of getting my master's degree and studying white-tailed deer and how people think about them and how we can sort of integrate our understanding of deer ecology with these sort of desires of hunters and farmers and people who live in the area who don't like having their tulips eaten by deer, how we can integrate that into deer management, was that the people part of it was the most complicated. So after that experience, maybe I'm sort of a glutton for punishment and decided that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my career, was spend my time working on that complicated piece. And so I worked for about 5 years doing human dimensions research at the University of Illinois, and then had the chance to move to a much glitzier location in Colorado, and do now social science research for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And I'll talk a little bit about what it's kind of like to be a social scientist in a state agency, but I wanted to just sort of start with this background by way of making the point that, not every path needs to be direct. I mean, I started out in fisheries. I then sort of had this realization that I wanted to learn more about people, and now I'm, after working for 10 years and back in a PhD program, learning more about ecology than I expected to, and especially learning more about sort of quantitative approaches than I expected to, and sort of going back and forth in my career, but I've been able to sort of figure out a path that way. So that's maybe a long-winded way to say that there's no direct path to a job like the one I have, and sort of maybe reassurance if any of you feel concerned about that. I always felt like I had no idea where I was going. And then I ended up here, and I really enjoy it. So I'm going to talk specifically today about bears and how we integrate social and ecological information to guide bear-human conflict management in Colorado. And more than anything, I'm going to sort of provide you with a context for how we do these sorts of things. How do we think about these big problems? And I'm going to give you a little glimpse of some results that we have already. But the project I'm talking about is sort of in the middle of the data collection stage, toward the tail end of the data collection stage. So I don't have a ton of really earth-shattering results for you yet. But I think just the process of sort of how we think about this will be valuable. So first I'm going to talk about conflict. And then I'm going to build on what Corey sort of said as she was introducing me. I'm going to talk about bear conflict specifically as a social ecological system. So how do we really frame this as a problem that's driven by both social processes and ecological processes? I'm going to talk about Durango some, and then I'll give you those preliminary results that I talked about. So like many species, people and bears interact in a wide variety of ways, and those interactions are positive and negative. And so they might be people going hunting specifically for bears or hiking and seeing bears along a trail. They also can be purposeful or sort of context dependent, right? That person who's hunting a bear is specifically going out to hunt a bear, right? But somebody who happens to leave their garage door open and has a sow and a couple of cubs wander in didn't intend for that to happen in all likelihood. So there's this control piece that's a little bit different depending on the issues. And they also range in sort of seriousness from things like a bear getting into your garbage can, that's a nuisance to clean up, right? So that's one type of conflict that we deal with, is sort of at the nuisance level. But then we have things where we have bears breaking into homes, we have bears breaking into cars, we have bears threatening pets. And so that sort of increases the level of seriousness of those interactions. So, the point here is that there's, a wide variety of ways that people and bears interact. And as a management agency, our job is to sort of provide all of the positive stuff and get rid of all the negative stuff, which is really hard to do. And so one of the things that I'll talk about now is sort of, or as I go through this, is one way that we try to reduce some of the negative conflicts. So as I said, we get a lot of sort of call to reduce conflicts in Colorado. And we don't know all that much about why conflicts happen. There are a couple of things we do know. One of those is that conflicts in Colorado are increasing. So this graph shows the number of conflicts between bears and people that were reported to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, starting in 1986 and moving through 2003. You can see that there's sort of a low level till 95. 95 was a drought year. And then especially after 98, this trend is increasing. If we could take this and draw it out to 2015, where we are right now, the spikes would go right through the roof. There were 450 reported conflicts in 2002, which was another drought year in Colorado. In 2012, in Durango alone, remember these are statewide reports, in Durango alone we had more than 1,000 reports. So this number would skyrocket if you could keep sort of extended out to the current time. The other thing that we know is that we in Colorado are not unique in this pattern. In 2007, some folks did a survey of agency staff across the country, and there are 41 states that have bear populations. 30 of those states reported seeing the same trend in reported conflicts. So we know conflicts are increasing. We know that many states are dealing with this. But we don't exactly know the drivers of all of these different types of conflicts. One indication that we have is changing land use of what might be a driver of this conflict. So this is La Plata County on the southwest part of the state, which is not that far from here. I'm used to talking about this in Fort Collins, which is like, we're in a different place now. But Durango is this green area in the middle of the county. So in 1970, these orange areas show the sort of footprint of human development. In 1970, you can see that there was relatively little human development in the county. I just want to take a second also to point out that this is some of the best bear habitat in the state as well, as a really great place for people to live. So especially this area through here, and then up the Animas River Valley and up these river valleys, is really, really great bear habitat. Most of the white parts are a little high for bears to spend a lot of time, but in 1970, the county looked like this. In 1990, it looked like this. And in 2012, it looks like this, right? So I think this is a pretty clear demonstration of the fact that we have a lot more people spread out on the landscape in this county. And this is a similar pattern that's happening all over the state of Colorado. During that time, we don't have good data on what bear populations look like in Colorado, but during that time, especially between the 1990 and 2012 piece, the bear population in Colorado probably increased, but not all that much. Certainly not as much as the human population increased. So one of the things that happens when people come somewhere is they bring food with them. So all of these people, all these individual little squares are parcels where there's at least one home in many of those cases, maybe more. And those homes have garbage cans, they might have fruit trees, they might have a garden, they might have chicken coops or livestock, they might have apiaries. So if you can imagine that sort of orange spread, right, spreading out not only people in the landscape, but also food, you can kind of get a picture of how the habitat has changed for bears, right? Bears are an incredibly long-lived species. We've got bears in our study area, collared bears that are 20 years old. So they're an incredibly long-lived species. They're a super food-motivated species. They require 20,000 calories a day during the hyperphagia period, so the period before denning between July 1st and October 1st, roughly in Durango. 20,000 calories a day is about 35 Big Macs, the equivalent of 35 Big Macs, right? And they are built to search out food because of those high caloric demands. So they can smell for up to 5 miles. They're strong. They're smart. They have as close as most mammals get to sort of the equivalent of our hands, right? They can manipulate a lot of things with their paws. So we've sort of created this like perfect storm for bears, right? We've spread this like really attractive food source, really easy to find food source out across the area that they already lived. And we've sort of been lax about how we've dealt with those food sources. So we know that, you know, human development plays into conflict in a certain point, and many, especially municipalities, not necessarily whole counties, but many places in the state have considered or have placed ordinances that require people to keep garbage secure from bears as a mechanism to try to reduce conflict. What happened, though, is that counties sort of glommed onto this idea, right? But there never had really been a great test of what the effects of that were on bears and conflict, or on people and how they perceived conflict. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do here is understand the effects of a bear-proofing effort on people's perception of conflict. So when we see all that conflict happening, we do a mix of 4 things as a management agency. And I sort of alluded to the fact that Colorado is not unique. This mix of 4 things is also not unique to Colorado. Most states and most federal agencies do some mix of these 4 things on land that they manage as well. So the first thing that we do here in Colorado, which would be unique to states, not necessarily federal agencies, is that we manipulate the number of bear harvest permits that are available. When we have an area that has high conflict, we increase permits with the assumption that that would increase hunter harvest, decrease populations, and decrease conflict. The other thing that we do is we have what we call a 2 strikes policy for black bears. When we have bears that are reported as causing conflict, the first time that they cause conflict, we move them, right? So we trap them, we give them an ear tag, we move them to somewhere where we hope they don't cause conflict again. That might be because it's a place where there aren't as many people, or it might be because it's a place that's far away from where when they caused conflict originally. If those bears happen to cause conflict again, they're in their second strike policy. So that's when we take this last step, that's lethally removing bears. There is an exception to this policy where we take a 2 strikes policy and turn it to a 1 strike policy, and that we lethally remove bears that we consider involved in serious conflict. The definition of serious conflict is slightly variable around the state, but if there's a bear that's causing a direct threat to people, and in many cases a direct threat to livestock, it's often lethally removed at that first strike, right? So this is something that nobody who works for Parks and Wildlife wants to do. Yeah, did you have a question?
So is it where they cause a conflict, or is it where someone causes a conflict with them? I mean, because you qualified it as where they cause a conflict.
Yeah, I think that's a matter of perspective, right? These bears are, in many cases where bears are lethally removed, they have broken into a chicken coop that did not have an electric fence. So, again, as Corey alluded to, there's different ways to sort of frame that conflict. Is that the bear's problem or the person's problem?
Is that considered a first strike?
It depends on where you are. In many cases, it's considered a first strike, but not in all cases. There are our law enforcement officers are usually the ones that sort of carry out the lethal control, and they have a certain amount of sort of flexibility in terms of how they interpret that. They might look at the situation in terms of whether they expect that bear would repeat or get worse in terms of their behavior. So if if it's a backyard chicken coop in downtown Fort Collins that bear broke into, I'd put money on the fact that it would be lethally removed because it's a densely populated area. If it's a chicken coop out in a more rural area, that might be a different situation. But I think one of the main points of this whole talk is that your perspective on the conflict will really affect what you think is acceptable or not acceptable in terms of what we do. So, yeah, Lori.
Could I ask, in terms of like first strike, is a bear getting into garbage at someone's house a first strike, or would that not be considered? That's just considered you need to get another garbage can.
Yeah.
Or,
Again, that's probably even more variable than that sort of livestock involvement case. In most cases, it's not, unless maybe that bear is habitually hitting a particular really small area, right? And then you've sort of identified. Sometimes we'll have places. There was a case in Estes Park early this past summer where it was a very identifiable bear. It was a really light colored bear, like they called it this like cinnamon, kind of like really light brown bear. So people could really quickly pick out that it was the same bear that they were seeing. And the bear was increasingly bold in its behavior. And so at that point, after they'd seen it around town in reports, and we typically don't move bears that we see in urban areas. But we do, when they start to cause conflicts, potentially we'll move them, right? So I think there were 2 trash-related conflicts, and then the bear broke into a house because there was a pie on the counter in the kitchen. And so at that point, that bear was killed. Because that bear, it never really even had a first strike, right? It didn't get moved. It had 2 garbage-related conflicts, and then they found it in a kitchen. And at that point, then, that's a threat to human safety. And so there's a real balancing act, and our law enforcement officers take that really seriously. Nobody, as I said, nobody wants to do this, right? None of us at any level of our agency got into this field to kill bears. And kill bears in a way that's wasteful. I mean, in my opinion, right? Like if we are using recreational hunting to reduce bear populations, there's some benefit to that to someone, right? But this is a whole different situation. We have to balance that desire to have bears on the ground with the expectation that we provide safe places for people to be. And that's a really hard line to sort of walk, and it's really hard to define. It's very gray. So I'm not typically one to stand up here and sort of defend really strict rules about this is one way and this is another way. And I'm sort of more of a context-dependent kind of a person. But I feel very confident in saying that this is not something that we really ever enter into lightly. It's not lethal control is not something that we're sort of like, okay, fine, we're just going to kill all the bears. I think that decision is weighed very heavily. So those are sort of the 3, bear-related things that we do. And then we have this 4th thing that we do that we call this big umbrella of education, right? And that's sort of everything to do with people. And we have bear-aware teams, and we have people who work with communities to do bear-related education, and we have website materials, we have all sorts of stuff. But it sort of all just says, like, people, do your part, right? Keep your garbage, keep your food secured from bears, don't provide attractants. It's your individual responsibility to do that. So we've been doing this mix of 4 things for a long time. And if you remember back to that graph, conflicts keep going up. So we know that the things that we're doing and the way that we're doing them isn't fixing the problem, right? We don't see that graph starting to tail off. We see some spikes when we have things like natural food failures due to drought or late frost or things like that, which we can't necessarily control, and we'll sort of always have some spikes. But the overall trend is still upward. It's not even plateauing or tailing off at all. So this is sort of the situation we found ourselves in about 5 years ago, is that we're doing all this stuff, and we still keep seeing more and more conflict every year. And then communities like Boulder, like Steamboat Springs, like Estes Park, started to implement these or talk about implementing these bear-proofing ordinances, and especially requiring people to use bear-proof garbage containers. And we jumped right on board with that, saying, absolutely, that's a great way to deal with bear conflict in your community. what was interesting, though, is no one in the country has experimentally tested how bear-proofing, especially in an urban community, has changed conflict rates. So that was what we decided to do, right? We decided to take the city of Durango and experimentally bear-proof 2 areas and then look at how that changed conflict. So I'm going to come back to Leopold now. And in this really long quote, basically what he says, he wrote this in 1935 in an essay called Wilderness. But basically what he says is ecology sort of has these 2 branches of people who are interested in it. There are people who deal with people, and there are people who deal with plants and animals. And they sort of keep to themselves, and they don't really talk to each other. And they sort of leave the messy stuff to the other side, right? And this bolded part here, I think, is the most important. He talks about fusing these 2 lines of thought, right? Integrating social and ecological information as the outstanding advance of the century in wildlife management, right? And he said this in 1935. We struggle with the same thing today, and bear conflict is a really great example of that, right? We know that there's a contribution of bear behavior, and there's a contribution of human behavior to that problem, but our management actions deal with one or the other. We don't sort of integrate our understanding to try to manage bear conflict. So this project is an example of a way to try to do that, and I like to think that someday I'm going to be able to say that I made a small contribution to Leopold's outstanding advance. Just an aside, this is a quote that motivates a lot of the work that I do, right? Is that sort of trying to think about how do we use biological information and social information both to make good decisions and deal with those complicated conflict situations that Corey talked about. So in 2004, some people who are entirely smarter than I am came up with this idea of social ecological systems. And it's really just a complicated way to describe what Leopold stated in 1935 that we needed, right? And this definition is probably just as complex as the actual systems themselves. But the point of it is that there are biological factors and there are social factors, and they relate to each other in a whole bunch of different ways, and there's feedbacks between those systems. And I'm a really visual learner, so when I put a definition up here like this, I like to sort of have a graphic that displays it. And so if we take a social ecological system idea and apply that to human-wildlife conflict, in its very simplest form, it would look like this, right? Here's our social ecological system. We've got ecological components, wildlife activities on one side, human activities on the other. Where those overlap provides the opportunity for conflicts. It's probably more appropriate to have this titled human-wildlife interactions instead of just conflicts in the middle here. Because, as I said before, some of those interactions are quite positive and are quite intentional. And as you'll see in some of the results later, that's, I think, a really important point to recognize. And I think something that we as managers kind of struggle to deal with. We sort of get really focused on the conflict piece of it and forget about the positive part. So if we try to make this a little more useful, right, this is pretty, duh. It's not particularly useful. So if we try to expand this out and make it a little bit more useful, it looks a little bit something like this. And for any of you with an ecological background, this piece probably looks pretty familiar. And for those of you with a social science background, this piece might look pretty familiar. But I think what's really interesting about this is showing how they overlap, right? So we know that ecosystems, things like the locations of rivers and the amount of forest cover affect bear. So in this case, individual behaviors are individual bear behaviors, right, or individual animal behaviors. So those things all affect individual animal behaviors. Community interactions like the availability of natural food or competing species affect individual behaviors. And then interactions within populations affect individual behaviors. A subset of individual bear behaviors have the potential to lead to conflicts. If we work from the other side in, societal level influences are those things that, that sort of determine broad scale patterns, especially of human land use and human development, or residential development. And so those might be things like technological advances that allow people to communicate and telework, right? Which means that they can live somewhere distant from where maybe their headquarters office is. So people can live in the beautiful Gunnison Valley and work in Denver, right? So that sort of affects how people decide where to live. Institutions here represent decisions that agencies like mine make. So that two strikes policy we talked about, could affect whether someone decides to report a conflict or not report a conflict. If they have very strong feelings against that lethal control piece, no matter how severe the conflict is, they may decide not to report that to Parks and Wildlife because they don't want that bear to be killed, right? The other side of that may be true as well. People may be more likely to report sort of lower level conflicts if they really support a sort of bear-free zones in urban areas, for example, or something like that. So that's kind of what the institutional piece means. And then there's this group influence, and so that's the idea of norms and how group membership sort of sets expectations for how people behave in a particular area. And so those might be, an example with bears would be, you know, if you have a block in a neighborhood and there's one person who's particularly vocal about people keeping their garbage locked up, they might walk around to their neighbors if they see their garbage can tipped over in the morning, and they might say, man, I noticed that your garbage was tipped over. That was crummy. You know, next time keep your garbage locked up, because if you cause that problem, that has an effect on me too. So that person just sort of set the expectation for how everyone in the neighborhood should behave. And so all of these things influence individual human behaviors, and again, a subset of those have a potential to cause conflicts. So this is sort of the big picture, especially on the social science view. But there's this social psychological theoretical background that in human dimensions especially we've applied to understanding individual behavior. And it has a foundation in what we call rational actor models. So this is the really heavy social science wonky part. So I don't blame anybody if your eyes glaze over at this part. So especially in human dimensions, we've spent a lot of time not focusing on these kind of influences, but focusing on these more cognitive influences on individual behaviors. So this is sometimes called the cognitive hierarchy, or the values, attitudes, behaviors model. And so basically what this assumes is that people make rational choices, right? They assess what their values are, that informs their beliefs, which informs their attitudes, and all these things determine their behavior, right? This is sort of an almost an economic model, right? That assumes that people are always acting in their best interest, and that if you understand these things, you can understand and predict behaviors, right? And so this is where the majority of the human dimensions field has sort of focused in terms of understanding human behaviors, right? But what we now know is that two things. One, emotion plays a huge role in there that's mostly unstudied, especially in the natural resources field. On all of these levels, right? It can affect values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors directly. And then there are the influences of these sort of bigger level forces that we haven't typically addressed. So I point all of this out to you by way of context, and sort of to hopefully make this presentation something that you might be able to take to thinking about other situations, right? We don't, as a field, we don't do a good job of measuring this and of measuring many of these influences. But we've got a lot of history of measuring this stuff. Unfortunately, we don't do a very good job of predicting behavior by measuring this stuff, right? So we know that we need to at least acknowledge the role of those. So if we take this model and apply it to bears and people and garbage, it looks a little bit like this, right? And the idea here is that, you know, all of these pieces interact, but they also have important feedbacks. What I don't like about that previous slide is that those circles look really neat and sort of self-contained, right? They don't overlap with each other, and there's a lot of feedback within this system, right? So those societal pieces I talked about interact with ecosystem components to determine where people build cabins and build homes, right? So those two things come together. And so I think that this illustration does a really nice job of sort of showing how some of those feedbacks might play out. So this is what the system looked like, right? This is what we sort of started with. And we had to figure out, okay, where are the important gaps in our knowledge, especially related to bear proofing, right? Bear garbage-related conflict. Where do we not know a lot of things? And so I'm going to quickly walk through the project itself and the way we answered some of these questions. But I'm going to do exactly what I said that we shouldn't do just a couple of seconds ago. We're mostly not going to measure this societal stuff. We have some ways, small ways to measure the institutional stuff, and better ways to measure some of the group stuff, but mostly I'm going to focus on that cognitive piece of it because it's the easiest part to measure, right? So that's sort of the history of why that part has such emphasis in the human dimensions. So we, as I said, many communities want to implement these city ordinances that require people to use bear-proof garbage cans, but that model had not been tested. So we took the city of Durango. Is anybody from Durango or spent a lot of time in Durango? Nice. Okay. I like to have people in the audience that understand where some of this stuff is. So that's okay. So we took the city of Durango, identified 2 study areas within it, divided them in half, and gave 2 of those 4 resulting areas, gave every person who lived in that area, every household, one of these garbage cans. And so these garbage cans look just like the regular sort of garbage cans, but they have these bear-proofing pieces on the top of them. And so they are bear-proof. And we gave them to all of the people in the area. So we did 3 years of pre-treatment monitoring of bear use. So we put radio collars on bears and looked at where they used areas inside Durango. The second thing we measured was bear-human conflict. So we did 3 years of pre-treatment monitoring on where conflict was happening related to garbage before we gave out the cans. And then we did 1 survey where we asked people what they thought about conflict and their values and attitudes about wildlife and some of those group and institutional pieces. Then we gave out the cans, and we did the same things for 3 years after, and we're in that 3rd year right now, that 3rd treatment year. So just to sort of give you a graphic depiction of what that looks like, these are the study areas. This is the Animas River running through the middle of downtown Durango. The blue areas are the treatment areas, and the purple areas are the control areas. So the treatment areas are where we gave out the bear cans. In 2012, before we gave out the cans, only about 4% of people had bear-proof cans. Those are the yellow dots, and the green dots are regular garbage cans. We gave out the cans in May 2013. In August of 2013, we had good coverage with our bear cans, but we had some people who had sort of snuck their regular cans through, so we had some cleanup to do. In 2014, we reached 98% of homes that had bear-proof cans in the treatment areas, and that was about as effective as we really could be. So the garbage can situation went from looking like that to like this. And so let's talk a little bit about results. Remember, we're measuring 3 things: bear movements, conflict, and then people's attitudes. I'm going to focus here really on the people part of it, people's behaviors and their attitudes, because that's the part that I was most involved in and the part that I think is really cool. So our first question was trying to understand what drives tolerance for black bears. And this is the last bit of theory. And then we'll move into really much more fun to talk about results. So this is just any random wildlife population over time, increasing in size, decreasing in size, sort of changing over time, right? And we use 2 ways to sort of set capacity for wildlife populations. One of those is probably something you guys are really familiar with, and that's biological carrying capacity, right? And biological carrying capacity has been really well studied. It's sort of a foundational piece in sort of the wildlife management field. And we know what drives biological carrying capacity. We know why it's here, right? We know what would drop it down or raise it up, and that's food, water, and shelter, and the arrangement of those things in space. So there's this analog on the social side called tolerance, or the technical term that people often use is acceptance capacity. And it's kind of the same idea, right? What's the limit on the top end of the negative things that people could tolerate with a species? But there's also a bottom end for it, and that's why it's shown as a range here, right? There are positive interactions that people seek out, and if the population went below that, they would also that would be below their acceptance capacity. They wouldn't be satisfied with that population. The challenge in this is we don't know what drives acceptance capacity. So we don't have that answer of sort of food, water, and shelter. We can manipulate the amount of food available. We can winter feed, for example, for mule deer, and we can raise the biological carrying capacity of an area. We don't know what drives acceptance capacity. So the first question we asked is, what drives acceptance capacity? So we tested a bunch of models of acceptance capacity, and I'm going to walk through these relatively quickly. but I want to point out a couple of them specifically. So the first model that we tested was conflicts, right? Is it conflict? Is it only the bad stuff that drives people's tolerance for bears? The second model is what we call the psychological model, and that really focuses in on that rational actor model, right? And so we're talking about how similar people think they are to the management agency, how similar they think their values are, whether they trust the agency, and how that affects perceived risks and benefits, and whether that drives acceptance capacity. Another piece of that cognitive model is just a straight value orientation model, and there's been a lot of work that shows that value orientations toward wildlife affect people's behaviors. Then there's always this idea that, like, old people think one way, young people think another way. Women think one way, men think another way. So there's this demographic model that encapsulates some of that. And then last, we tested what we call this impacts model. And impacts are, I'm going to, again, define these. Actually, I took that side out. As their interactions with wildlife, but their interactions with wildlife sort of viewed through the lens of that individual person. So things that people think are both important and likely to happen to them. That's how we measure impacts. So not all interactions between people and bears would fall into these categories, only the things that for that individual they think are important. So if I really, really think it's cool to see a bear when I'm walking through my neighborhood, that's going to be something that for me is an impact. But if my neighbor who filled out the survey as well doesn't think that that's really that big of a deal, positively or negatively, then that wouldn't be an impact for that person. So basically, it's a way to sort of weight all of those possible interactions. And this is split into positive and negative. So we compared those models. What we found is that the conflict model, the values model, and the demographic model were not very good predictors. The psychological model was okay. We used a model selection process. I'm not going to talk a lot about the methods here. But what we found was that the best model was this impacts model, right? So those really important things, positive and negative, that drive people's, that's what really drives people, how people think about bears. So when we took all of those, as the second step, we took all of those same variables and put it into a single model and found out, we sort of identified which of those were the important predictors. And these yellow highlighted ones, for those of you who are interested, those places where the confidence intervals overlap 0 indicates significance in an information theoretic framework. These are the yellow highlighted ones are the things that were important predictors of acceptance capacity. So you notice in two different models, right, pieces from two different models, where we see positive and negative, benefits and risks, and positive and negative impacts here. So that was thinking back to what I talked about at the beginning. You know, what we learned from this is that really it's both positive and negative that are driving people's tolerances. There really is an upper and a lower limit. It's not just about the conflicts that people experience, which as a management agency, we sort of assume it's just all about the conflicts. It's all about the bad stuff, right? We also find that there's some effect of both age and gender. So the second question then deals specifically with those bear cans. So remember I told you that we gave out cans to everybody who lived in those areas, right? When we did that, we assumed that if we gave people cans, the primary reason there was only 4% of bear proofing before we started this project, we assumed was because those cans cost $250 a piece, right? So they're super expensive. So we spent $500,000 on the 2,000 cans that we gave out, right? And we assumed if we gave people cans, they would bear proof. The only thing holding them back was the cost. Well, what we actually found was, so this question didn't exist when we started the project. This was not something that we set out to answer. But what we actually found when we started monitoring those cans in the first year after we gave them out was that only about 45% of people actually latched their cans, right? So that turned into this research question of why the heck is this, right? Why not this? Why are we not up here, which is what we assumed would happen? Why are we way down here? So in 2013, we had about 45% of people who latched their cans. It went up a little bit in 2014, so I think there's definitely some learning going on. And we separate out the north and the south treatment areas for one important reason, and that's that the sort of home ownership pattern is different between those two areas. if you remember the map, the north area was the top piece and the south area is the bottom piece. The south area is sort of in the downtown area of Durango and tends to be a lot of rental units and a lot of students associated with Fort Lewis, people who are living there seasonally, and a lot of houses sort of split into multiple apartments with multiple people sort of living in them. The North Treatment area is single-family homes. Most of them have garages, so they have another place to store their garbage rather than sort of in an alley or next to their house. And so we expected that people would behave differently in those two areas, but they actually didn't behave all that differently. So we were pretty disappointed with that, and we built this question around trying to understand why that was so low. And this is where the results start to get really preliminary in that I don't have the full picture. So the plan is that we'll model out a behavior at the individual level using a whole bunch of things: experience of conflict, that sort of group norming activity, so whether your neighbors keep their garbage bear-proofed, age, gender, impacts perceived, things like that, at the level of the individual parcel to predict this compliance. I don't have that analysis completed yet. We don't have all that data collected. But I have some indications from some of our early surveys that I think are interesting results. So we asked people in our first survey before we gave out the garbage cans why they might voluntarily take action to reduce risk on their own. Remember, this is before we gave out the cans. So these are things that people are doing without our influence, right? And most of the people who said that they did take action and told us why they took action, the sort of three most common reasons were to keep bears acting wild, to prevent bears from being killed, and to protect themselves and their families, right? And then the why not piece of those people who didn't take action told us they really felt that conflict with bears was a part of living in Durango, right? Part of the reason they were attracted to Durango was because wildlife were there, and it was just something they had to face as a cost of living in Durango, right? And then a good number of them hadn't experienced their definition of a negative interaction. So we don't know whether this means they never had a bear knock over their garbage can or they didn't interpret that as negative, right? And so again, this further analysis will dig into a lot of that more. We also asked people, if we kind of think back to those 4 approaches that we take as managers for conflict, we asked people what they thought about a lot of different things that we could do associated with bear conflict. And overwhelmingly, people thought it was a great idea to have individual responses, sort of encourage people to be individually responsible for the way they store garbage. So we should require bear-proof garbage. We should fine people if they unintentionally feed bears, which means they leave their garbage out, right? And that they also felt that the most effective method to do that would be, to bear-proof, would be requiring bear-proof garbage containers at the residential level, right? So the people were really highly supportive and really thought it would be effective to do this bear-proofing piece, again, before we gave out these cans. But if we look at the things that we actually do, right, as an agency, people didn't like the idea that we use hunting licenses, and they also didn't think it was very effective to use hunting licenses to control conflict. And even that sort of killing bears that cause multiple conflicts, when we phrased it that way, there was still low support and low perceived effectiveness for that action. So the things that we're doing, people who live in Durango don't really think that the things that we're doing are a good idea, and they also don't think that they work, right? So they've got a good sense of what's actually going on, because we also know that they probably aren't working the way that at least that we like them to work. So the third question that we asked in this project is trying to understand how the effects of a change in real risk of conflict affects people's perceived risk. So when we bear-proofed the 2 treatment areas, we assumed that we would reduce people's real risk, right? We remove attractants. That means bears aren't going to go to that area anymore. They don't have a reason to go to that area, so we assumed they would shift their behavior to those control areas. And that's one of our biological questions, is how do bear movements change with this sort of treatment, right? So keeping garbage secured from bears. But what the sort of human analog to that is, how does that affect people's perceived risk? And we expect that their perceived risk probably plays into that compliance piece, right? If people think they're really at risk of conflict, they're probably more likely to take those behaviors to reduce their risk. Yeah?
did you actually get to reduce the real risk?
Well, that's what I'm going to show you. Just hold on one second. Yeah. So again, preliminary results here. We don't have that sort of real to perceived risk comparison completed yet because we're still collecting the last year of field data right now. But what we do know is the real risk reduction. So 2012, in those study areas, what we did, and for those of you who know Ryan, this is what part of what Ryan is doing this summer, is driving around those 2 study areas before 6 a.m. every morning and looking for these conflicts, right? Looking for these locations where garbage cans are knocked over and taking GPS locations of them, and we're doing some spatial analysis on that. It's one component of what he's doing this summer. So what we saw in 2012 in those 2 study areas, we had relatively consistent number of conflicts over time. 2012 was the last year before we gave out the garbage cans, about 50-50 split between the control and treatment area. In 2013, that was about the same. And in 2014, conflict shifted to the control area. 80% of the conflicts that we saw were in the control area and only about 20% in the treatment area. So we see that conflict, at least. We don't know whether bear movements yet are shifting to the control area, but conflicts themselves are shifting to the control area. So that's success in a lot of ways, or that's an indicator of success, because if you remember back, we only had less than 50% of people who even kept their cans locked up. And even with that low level of compliance, we still saw a significant change in the distribution of conflicts between control and treatment. So just to really quickly wrap up, and then I've got, I think we'll have some time for questions, I hope. Perfect. So we found with that first question was that both risks and benefits, positives and negatives, affected people's tolerance for bears. That voluntary compliance was low when we gave people cans. There were not that many people that actually used them. But keeping even 50% of trash secured from bears really did affect conflict rates. So as I also said, there's a lot more coming from this, a lot further analysis that we'll be doing. And we're hoping to really learn a lot more about how people and bears interact and how those interactions affect people's behavior, and use that to really do a much better job of managing conflict and sort of broaden out from those 4 approaches, broaden out our tools in our toolbox to include a lot of different things. And so I just want to make a couple of quick points about some of the communication impacts or implications that this information might have. So we typically, when we talk about that bear aware stuff that I talked about, it only focuses on risks, right? It says, if you don't lock up your garbage, you run the risk of having a bear break into your house, damage your property, make a big mess for you to have to clean up. And the risks to the bear are that the bear might get sick from eating human food, might get moved to a different area, might get killed because we remove it from the population, or might get hit by a car, right? We focus all of our communications on risks. But what we found is that if we talk about benefits, that might be a better motivator of people's behaviors because that affects acceptance capacity as much or more as risk-related statements. The second piece that we know that I think will have real communication implications is that those conventional management strategies, the mix of those 4 things that we talked about, people don't think that's acceptable, right? They don't think that that's the way that we should be doing our job. And they also don't think they're effective. So if we're out there doing all these things that we realize is probably not very effective, and people don't think it's effective, right? We always did it, even though we thought it was not effective, we did it because we thought people wanted it, because they sort of demanded it of us. If that's not actually true, that changes the equation a lot, right? And so that might change what we do. So that has a lot of internal communication implications, I think, in terms of how we make decisions inside of our agency. And I think the last piece that is really important to point out is that reducing conflicts, in order to reduce conflicts, we might not actually need every person to do the right thing. And when I talked about those education materials before, they also focus on the fact that it's everybody's job, right? It's do your part to be bear aware is sort of the tagline on all of those. It's everybody's job to do this stuff. In reality, we really only need 50% of people to affect conflict rates, potentially. We might need more than that in some places or in some years when natural food is in short supply. But we've got some indication that we might rethink how we define success at the very least internally. Maybe we don't totally change our external communications, but we don't actually need every person in a community potentially to take an action. We just need to hit this critical mass. So those are some of the things that I can see right off the bat as sort of important implications in terms of how we do our jobs. But I'd love to hear if you guys have other thoughts about how we might use this information to better manage conflict. And I'm also happy to take questions. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering if maybe the Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a percentage like that you're aiming for reduced conflicts. Are you aiming for like a 20% reduction, or are you kind of just looking for that flip in usage like you were showing us on that graph for 2014?
So we are starting to put that information into our bear management plans. So we write bear management plans for what we call data analysis units, which are roughly bear populations geographically. And that is one of the things that's a result of this project, is that we're starting to put in actual goals that relate to conflict reduction. So in this particular geographic area, we would like to see over the next 10 years an X% reduction in conflict. And what that's allowing us to do is really identify particular areas in the state where conflict is the most important thing driving bear management, right? There are areas of the state, in terms of, again, addressing that complexity that Corey talked about, there are areas of the state where conflict is not much of an issue, where we actually want increasing bear populations because there's a desire, people want to see more, people want more access for hunting bears. So there are some places where that's the opposite goal, right? So we're trying to be as geographically specific as we can, approach it on a scale that's as appropriate as possible. But in some areas, so the Durango area, the Aspen area especially, you know, those management plans are driven primarily by controlling conflict.
And then sorry to feedback.
No, that's
a question. I'm just wondering, do you guys look at the East Coast bear management at all? Because I know that the bears are just insane in Durango, pretty much, like Virginia, Tennessee, like that. Do you guys use their models at all?
Yeah, so we don't use the habitat models, like the sort of population models, because their habitat is so different. But we do, you know, one of the things that is maybe a benefit of that sort of all the states being in the same boat piece of information is that there's a really good information sharing between state agencies about what works, what doesn't work, what works better in this situation, what works a little bit better, and making steps. So we've got a lot of interest from other states in sort of how this shapes up. And then we're trying to learn from other places and what they've done that's worked or not worked. So, yeah.
Is there any sort of public issue with the control area, the people who live in the control area, like basically having bears funneled into their neighborhood?
Yeah, that's something we have to be very careful about how we talk about it. Talk about a communication implication.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like that might also eliminating that control area might also change the overall effect.
Right.
You know, because the bears, you know, yeah, they're not going to go to the place where the bear-proof trash bins are.
Mm-hmm.
If there's this other area that they can go to,
right,
the data might just be totally different.
Yes.
Everybody is bear-proof.
Right, and so that's why we built in, we used what's called a BACI design, so before-after control impact design. And so we have a temporal component of it, so that's the before and after, right? Within the treatment area, we can look at conflict rates before and after we gave out the cans, before we did our treatment. And then we have that control and treatment comparison. And the reason there is to be able to try to control as much as possible for all those extenuating circumstances that might be alternate explanations for any change in conflict. So natural food production, right? We know that that affects bears' use of human foods a lot. And so if we had, the whole area was treatment, right? All of those places, we had given out cans to everybody who lives in Durango. We wouldn't be able to necessarily tease out the effect of a good food year and a bad food year on conflict separate from the bear proofing experiment. So that was why we used a control and treatment approach within the same community to keep the sort of behavior as similar as possible. The complication to that has been really methodological, right? And so we've got two pieces that are complicated in that way. One is we're trying to not talk all that much right now about how conflict rates are changing in Durango because we don't want to change people's behaviors either, right? We don't want people in the control area to say, what? We've got all these conflicts? I'm getting myself one of those $250 cans, right? So we don't want them to change their behavior. In a perfect world, we'd say, you can't do it, right? You cannot change, but we don't have that much control over people. So, so we've been trying not to talk about it very much. And that's been complicated in terms of how, I mean, the people in Durango are super interested in what's happening. This is the community that had 1,000 reported conflicts in one 4-month season in 2012. Like, people are, and they also really care about bears. So there's a sort of like this balance there. And so we've had to sort of walk a very careful line about how we talk about it and what we do. So we're trying to minimize it at this point, and then we'll sort of give all the results at the end. Thankfully, we have the support of the city and the city council, which has been really, really important because they've been able to sort of make a strong case with the city newspaper and things like that about why we maybe we should wait until the end to talk about some of these results. Yeah.
You kind of touched on my question, but
Yeah.
one of the maps, it sort of did look like in the control area there were more
Yes.
bear group camps.
Yeah. Like I said, we can't control people, right? So there definitely are, and that's one of the things that we're tracking. So the way we get this data is one time every summer, we go to every house, every parcel, and we look at what kind of garbage can they have. And so we do it on garbage day, and if we don't get it all the first week, we go back a second week until we get every parcel, right? But you'll notice down here in the control areas, there's very little yellow, not so much yellow, a lot more yellow, kind of this right here in the south treatment area, this part of the south control area. This is where we have most of our conflicts. So there's a lot more yellow here than there was in 2013 or 2014 or 2013. And in the north area, you see even more, right? So you see much more yellow as we go through time. So that's something we're controlling for, but we're controlling for in our models. We don't have the ability to tell people they can't do it. So we just have to sort of, with these that's one of the dangers of these long-term experiments, right? A species like bears and a species like people, you need to have more than 1 year of data to see how learning happens, right? In 2013, if we had done this just 1 year, we would have concluded that there was no effect if we just looked at 2013 in terms of conflicts, right? Because it's taking a while for bears to learn that they're not getting the reward if they go up here. So people, I think, are the same in that they're learning kind of both directions. These people are learning that that's more effective, that's why compliance is going up, and these people are learning that it's more effective, and that's why there's more yellow dots. Yeah, for sure.
What's the possibility of people being fined for being irresponsible with their trash? And
That question depends. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like that would be a motivation for people to actually, have a second to latch.
Yeah. So two things. One is first to comment on the effectiveness of enforcement. We did sponsored a project in Aspen in between 2000 and 2005 where we did basically that, right? Instead of giving people cans, letting them using them voluntarily, the city of Aspen has a bear proofing ordinance that's similar to one that Durango has and many other communities have. And they gave researchers at CSU the authority to write tickets to people, and especially to commercial businesses. And a lot of the conflict in Aspen is related to commercial businesses.
That was going to be my second question. Yeah, like are restaurants and businesses also required to have these types of...
Right. So in Aspen, what they found was that enforcement did have an effect on people's compliance in terms of keeping garbage secured from bears. It had more of an effect on commercial businesses than it did on residential garbage storage, but it was only about a 15% increase in compliance, unfortunately. So the flip side of that is that enforcement is really stinking expensive and hard to do, right? There are many communities where the police and the city, we as the Wildlife Management Agency have the legal right to enforce our no wildlife feeding law, right? So we can write anybody who lives anywhere in this state a ticket for feeding wildlife intentionally or unintentionally. And so that includes keeping your garbage available to bears. But there are an awful lot of cities where if we started to do that, we would lose total cooperation of that community on all on all things, not just about bears, right? So we run the risk of alienating those communities because they don't want people getting tickets for those sorts of things. They're more focused on safety issues and things like that, right? So, so that's a complicated sort of, it depends on the community whether enforcement is really a realistic option. There are some places where it's worked quite well. In Boulder, they've been enforcing their bear-proofing ordinance, and it's worked quite well in parts of their community. But it's done by community officers. It's not done by Parks and Wildlife. It's not done by their city police. It's sort of community volunteers that go out and do it. I think that changes things. And also, we know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do enforcement. And the results of that, the increased compliance, don't last all that long, so they don't carry over from year to year, right? If you get a ticket in 2013 and 2014, all bets are off about what you're going to do. So because we as a management agency have all of these responsibilities to do everything, right? The more time we spend writing people tickets for not keeping their garbage secured means the less time we spend increasing habitat for Gunnison sage-grouse. You know, a wide variety of things, right? It's a trade-off. We have a limited number of dollars and hours to spend. So we're trying to maximize the voluntary compliance and then throw the enforcement piece on top at the lowest level that we need to do so that we don't sort of tick off our community partners and we don't have to unnecessarily spend a lot of money and effort doing that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
How expensive is it to euthanize the bears, and how many bears are you euthanizing every year? Because I lived in Steamboat Springs for a little bit, and I don't remember how many exactly it was that they killed that the one summer I was there, but it was a lot.
We killed 30 bears in Durango in 2012. 30 bears. And then there were 40-ish more that were killed by cars or electrocutions or a variety of other sort of human-caused deaths just in the city, like immediate area around the city of Durango, right? So I don't know the cost of that. I don't know what it costs to kill a bear. I know it costs a lot in terms of our reputation, especially in a community where we have that high numbers of bears that we put down. So, yeah. Other questions?
So this question about the experiment, about confounding factors. Like,
yeah.
I know that people are composting more. Are there composting bear cans? And also in Boulder, I know there were some of the trash cans were broken, or would give the mechanism would break on.
Yeah.
Is that information incorporated into the experiment? And is it all this confounding?
Yeah, there's I could list and you could list and everybody in this room could list a million things that make this an imperfect experiment. But it's a real experiment in a real community. So one of the things we have to deal with is sort of balancing, making it the best that we can in light of reality. So one of the things we can't do, unfortunately, is we can't look in people's backyards. So we can't see their fruit trees. And we can't see whether they have gardens, and we can't see whether they have at-home composters. We can't see all these other things that could be attracting bears to this treatment area still, right? Which is certainly contributes at least to that 20%. And it may also contribute to sort of if there were more fruit trees, for example, in the control areas, we'd expect that naturally there'd be more conflict in those areas. So one of the things that we did to control for that was to collect 3 years of pre-treatment data. So we had a sense of the distribution of conflicts between these two areas, the 4 areas really, before we did anything at all. And so we can use that to then control for the effects that we find. So that's one of the things we did. And then some of it is we tried as hard as we can to minimize those things. So we picked these 2 parts of Durango rather than for those of you who are familiar with Durango, like this is Florida Road right here. Actually, this is Florida Road, and it runs out in this sort of like more sort of farmette kind of bigger lot size kind of developments. We didn't include areas up towards Durango Mountain Resort, Purgatory Ski area, because again, those areas got to be just sort of different in a lot of ways from these 2 areas. And then we're looking at these 2 areas separately, right? So we know that that one of the big differences is garages here, no garages here, renters here, single family, owner occupied houses here. So we look at the effects in these two areas separately. In terms of the damage to cans, that's another thing that Ryan gets to do, is when he sees a can that's been damaged, or we have a phone number where people can call and report damage to their cans, we replace them. So we spent $500,000 originally on cans, and we've replaced not that many, less than 50 cans over the 3 years so far. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but less than 50. So we're trying to, as much as we can, we're trying to sort of minimize the effects of those sorts of things. But that's one of the things that makes this a really interesting experiment, is it's a real community, right? Anything else that's been done like this, testing bear proofing, is in a really controlled environment, like Yosemite National Park, where backpackers have to check in. And someone can go through their backpack and look at their food and say, do you have it in a bear can or do you not have it in a bear can? And if you don't, here is a bear can for you to put it in, right? Really tightly controlled and really specific in terms of what the behaviors are, right? That's not what real life looks like. Like, this is real life. This is what communities face. So in Boulder, their situation looks even messier than this in some ways, but any regular community is going to face this same situation. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, for the treatment areas, after the third year, we were able to achieve about 20% less of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking of the factors, but why can't we have like 100%, or 0% for the treatment area?
Yeah. I think a lot of that has to do with the rates of compliance. Because even though we gave out, right, even though we got to 98% of households that had bear-proof cans here, only 50% of people were keeping them locked. So the other 50% of cans, even though they are technically bear-proof cans, they're functionally regular cans, because a bear could just knock it over and get into it just like a regular can. So I think that 20% comes from the fact that we don't have 100% compliance in this area. If we got, one of the things that we're trying to, sort of a second step to this project, what we're talking about doing, is doing things to try to increase compliance as high as we can get it in these areas. So enforcement and some other kind of communication strategies that we can use to really capitalize, especially on those norm activation and norm-related behaviors. We get compliance as high as possible, and then see what happens to conflict. Is there a threshold, right, where there's always going to be this sort of low level of conflict that we'll have to deal with? Or is it that when we get to as close as we can to 100% compliance, conflict goes to 0?
Well, is there any effort of the organization doing a kind of sensitization, constant sensitization for people to comply with the approved trash cans?
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that, for us not to have like 0% compliance for the treatment area, I'm just saying you highlighted the fact that people are not some people might not comply with the action. So I'm just saying that it's your organization. Are they trying to probably intensify some communication strategies in terms of awareness?
Yeah.
Probably constant one, just to get that into people's attitude, people's perception about what you guys are trying to achieve.
So we're trying not to do very much of that right now, because we want to get at that voluntary piece, and we want to keep things as consistent as possible over time. What we do, and what we have done every year at the beginning of the season, is we go to every house that has a bear-proof can and we tell them, hey, don't forget, you've got a bear-proof can. Now is the really important time of the year to use it. Here's how to use it. Here's the likely results of you using it. Please use it. And so we do that in the beginning of July every year when bears start to become active. And we've done that every year of the project. But we've kept it at a minimum, and we've kept it our sort of standard message, bear-aware kinds of messages that we use all over the state, because we're really trying to understand what are the effects of just giving people these cans. We're trying to isolate just that one thing in this project. But we're going to learn all sorts of stuff about this, and then the idea is then, so we'll have this 2013, 2014 data, right? And then we'll be able to design a really, really responsive, community-specific communication campaign, do that, and then see what happens, right? Because we'll have, this will be sort of our pre-treatment data about compliance. So, yeah. So I'm keeping myself employed for a really long time.
Last question. So
Yeah.
you said there was 30 bears killed in 2012.
Yeah.
How many bears were killed in 2014?
So 2013 and 2014, so the bears killed is much, just important point to make, that number is much bigger than just these study areas. This is only sort of the core area of Durango. Durango, if you went back, I can kind of show you here. So we're talking like right in here. So just this central area. Durango, the city limits of Durango are much larger than that. So that 30 number comes from this whole area, right? 2012 was a drought year. Yeah, if folks lived in Colorado at that point and remember, it was a drought year. It was also a year that we had a late frost. And so the way the Durango Valley is sort of set up is that if there's a late frost, it sort of kills everything in the low-lying areas, right? So that happens to be all of Durango and all of sort of the Animas River Valley, which is the sort of the best food locations. So in 2012, we had a late frost that killed all of the natural food sort of in this immediate vicinity around Durango, in addition to a drought. So terrible natural food, right? And that's likely one of the factors that made 2012 such an extreme spike. It wasn't that, all of a sudden we had, 1 million new homes or anything like that. It was that food availability. 2013 and 2014, and also 2015, have been great food years, great natural food production years. 2015 is exceptional in terms of precipitation and then the sort of length of the growing season. It got warm early. There was no late frost. There's great, acorns like this, squaw apples like this, things like, you can't believe how much food is out there for bears right now. So that's one of the things that so overall, that changes how many bears come into town and how many bears get killed. So the number of bears in 2013, 2014, and 2015 that were lethally removed was in the single digits. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with our experiment. That may have more to do with the natural food availability in all likelihood. So, yeah.
Let's do one more question first, and then we should probably head.
Yeah. I'm happy to stay and take questions all night if you guys want to stick around. But
in the treatment areas, does the conflict only count if the trash can is open and there's trash out, or is it like a knocked over trash can count as a conflict?
Mm-hmm. We changed how we defined conflict before and after the treatment. Before the treatment, a can that was knocked over and garbage was spilled was considered conflict. But then, in order to keep things really kind of fair, right, we had to, even if a can after the treatment was latched and not spilled, a bear had still been there to knock that can over, right? So that's technically, in order to keep it comparable, we had to count that as a conflict too. So the answer is sort of different in two different scenarios, or both in the two different scenarios. One of the things that's really a benefit about bears is it's really easy to pick out when it's a bear that knocks over a can or a teenager driving down the street that hits it and knocks it over. Most of the time they take a dump right next to it, to be totally crude about it. So there's confirming evidence, right? There's bear poop right next to the garbage can. And then, a car or something else that hits a garbage can, these cans are relatively heavy. And so if something else knocks over a can, it's not likely to do what a bear does, and that's pull all the bags out and tear them open and throw things around. And sometimes you can see, especially later in the year, like in the month of September, you'll see claw marks on trees, where they're doing other things. They're spending time there eating. And so that's one of the things that it's pretty easy to tell the difference between a can that's knocked over from the wind or from a dog or something like that and a bear conflict. And we spent a lot of time sort of piloting thinking about what it was gonna look like before we started to do it. And then we actually started to do it. It was really easy, mostly because of the poop. Yeah.
So all our parks and wildlife divide for the other half.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this shouldn't leave the room, but so one of the things that the city decided to do when we started this experiment, right? We had this commitment to do a 5-year experiment. And they committed to, so the project started because Durango wanted to put into place a bear-proofing ordinance like what Boulder did, so requiring everybody to have a bear-proof can and to pay for it themselves. Then we came in and we said, hey, let us do this experiment for 5 years and we'll pay for half the cans. And then during the 5 years of the project, they've taken what was a city excise tax. The city runs all the garbage collection in Durango, and they've taken what was a city excise tax that went, I don't remember what other purpose it went to, and they've dedicated it to buying bear-proof garbage containers, because we actually didn't bear-proof half of Durango. We really only bear-proofed half of this small piece of Durango. And so now the idea is that at the end of this 5-year project, they'll put that bear-proofing ordinance into place as long as we can show that it actually made a difference, and then they'll require that everybody has those cans, and they'll use some of that money to help offset the cost of them. Yeah. Don't tell anybody in Durango that, whatever you do. Thank you guys. You're a great audience and excellent questions.